A squared plus B squared equals C squared. This is a Pythagorean theorem, named after the Greek philosopher Pythagoras, and also made famous in every high school in America once you start studying algebra or advanced mathematics and learning about triangles. Not taxes, not how to be an adult, not how to run a business, but advanced mathematics that people will never use in their average everyday life. The important things you learn in high school. But in all seriousness, Pythagoras was an enigma, we can say. He was very much an interesting character of his time, as well as remembered throughout the history of the world. But not everything was as kosher as you might think. When many people think of Pythagoras, they think of a mathematician, this math genius, a guy who would go out there and possibly study math all day and all night, be a sage of it, be an intense scholar. But in reality, Pythagoras was in fact, he was a cult leader. He was just a very strange character in the history of the world. And I wanted to talk about him because I find him both very repugnant and very interesting at the same time. Especially when you actually learn about him that he wasn't as much of an intellectual genius that many people would think of him as, that he didn't run a school such as Plato in Athens or maybe Aristotle as what they might think of Pythagoras, but more of a pseudo-Buddhist-esque cult that he ran down in southern Italy. Now, I think Pythagoras is a very interesting character, but we're going to discuss him today, so let's get into it. So Pythagoras was born on the island of Samos, a Greek island, in around 570 BC. Now, there are some questions around Pythagoras dealing with, did he actually exist? Because much like Socrates, there's not actually anything written, because there's not actually anything that he wrote himself. Many accounts come from after the fact with him. In fact, hundreds, if not almost 1,000 years after his death. So there's some questions on whether or not he actually existed, but I think it's very possible that a man of Pythagoras did exist and was real, just as I believe that Socrates also existed. So Pythagoras was born on the island of Samos in 570 BC, and he was born to a very affluent family. He was very known as a studious child growing up. He loved to learn, he loved to explore, he loved to gain more knowledge. And while he was growing up, Samos was very much a big trading hub in the world. So many travelers from the east who probably gave him a sense of knowledge and wisdom also helped teach the young man as well. Now, eventually Pythagoras kind of came to a stopping point with his learning on the island of Samos, as it was very limited and small island at the time when it came to advanced learning. So Pythagoras himself didn't have an extra higher degree of learning that he could have gone to, such as a college or a university. So Pythagoras eventually had to leave his home island of Samos and travel east. In fact, he probably would actually have been traveling southeast, because his next step was Egypt. So when Pythagoras went to Egypt to advance his learning, because at the time Egypt was known as the most advanced nation or technological or even advanced learning place in the entire world, so Pythagoras traveled to Egypt to advance his knowledge. Now, when he went to Egypt, this is when myth and history kind of become mixed, because there's probably a lot of embellishment when it comes to Pythagoras and his life, but we're going to discuss it and try to figure out what the truth actually was. So when Pythagoras went to Egypt, he was said to have been very knowledgeable and taken in very quickly by the Egyptians. Very much essentially made one of their own, which did not happen to foreigners very quickly. He was able to learn from the Egyptians, be taught by them, and advance himself very quickly within them. In fact, even be taken in by their religion, which never happened. So take of that what you will, but to me the most ludicrous, we shall say, of all these adventures in Egypt was that of being taught by Pharaoh Amasis II. Now, take of that what you will, because Amasis II, hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly, was said to have taught Pythagoras, himself Egyptian. So the king of Egypt taught Pythagoras Egyptian. Definitely sounds a bit far-fetched in my opinion, but we make of that what we will. No matter the case, Pythagoras, when he traveled to Egypt, was able to learn quite a bit. In fact, this is probably where he learned many of the mystery school teachings that he would go on to teach himself. Now, what are the mystery schools? They are mysterious teachings, occult practices, very much followed by the Masons of today, as well as Pythagoras himself, like many Greek philosophers, was able to learn from the mystery schools of Egypt. In fact, there were some books written about that fact in and of itself, that the Egyptian mystery schools gave way to Greek philosophers. Now, how much of that is true? Probably a pretty good nugget, because it said that not only Pythagoras, but Socrates and perhaps Plato himself went to Egypt to learn from these mystery schools. Before this, Pythagoras himself was said to have studied under the sages. Now, the sages were the teachers of the time for Egypt, but Pythagoras was against them because essentially they were a hierarchical structure, and he didn't want to have authority with them. He didn't want to give them authority over himself. He wanted more so equality. But the major issue comes with this idea that once Pythagoras starts his own school, therefore becomes a lot of issues because he becomes a hierarchy of his own school. So once Pythagoras had come to his end in Egypt, he learned all that he could. He decided to move out and return to his home of Samos to begin his own school.
One more thing, though, too, about Pythagoras and his time in Egypt before we leave. Pythagoras himself did not actually create or discover the Pythagorean theorem. In fact, the Pythagorean theorem was discovered by the Egyptians about 1,000 years before Pythagoras ever was born. So, more than likely, he learned the Pythagorean theorem in Egypt and was able to pass it down to his students, who made it famous.
So there's actually two schools of history taught on what happened to Pythagoras once he returned to the island of Samos. Either one of two things happened. Either the first, that he became disenfranchised with the people of Samos, and when he started to teach them of these mystery schools, associated advanced learning, that they rejected this and they rejected him. So therefore, he decided to leave his home island of Samos and never to return. The second is that he came in conflict with the tyrant of Samos, Polycrates. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly. So he came in conflict with the tyrant of that time, and Pythagoras decided to leave Samos for good. After leaving Greece and the island forever, he decided to move to Italy, particularly southern Italy, Croton, southern Italy. He started his school named after himself, the Pythagorean school, where, to begin with, it was very much a cult in and of itself. So the school named after Pythagoras was very much a strange school indeed, due to the fact that to begin and to join the Cult of Pythagoras, you would have needed to have taken a 3-year vow of silence. Which, I don't know what they would have done for the time if they wanted to play football or watch football. I guess they would have to have screamed in their mind. But in all seriousness, this was very much a cult in and of itself, because some of the teachings of Pythagoras during the time was that the soul was immortal, something that I myself would agree with, but that the body was a prison. You see this very fallout in the Gnostics who follow after him. Second, that the body was a prison, and that's something you needed to escape from. But I guess, wanting to take your own life would have been probably too much for him. And the second would have been that your body is a prison, and that forever you are needed to move on from this prison and eventually get captured by others. Third, and that of reincarnation. So your soul would be reincarnated every single time you would die, and you would continue to learn and move on from this.
On the Cult of Pythagoras and their idea of reincarnation and long-lost spirits, depending on how they lived, coming back as something else, you can definitely tell the Buddhist influence on Pythagoras and his ideology. Now, it somewhat makes sense if you believe in reincarnation to be a vegetarian, because you don't know who you are eating if you're going to eat an animal, and you might kill an animal who might have the soul of somebody you once cared about, and obviously there's a lot of moral issues with that. There's also another story of Pythagoras. One day when he was walking by, he saw a dog being, I believe, whipped, and the dog was yelping, crying, and he ran over to the man who was whipping the dog, and he asked him to please stop, because the voice that he heard from the dog was that of his long-lost friend. So, plenty of times in Pythagoras' life, he would hear the reincarnation or talk to animals, or animals would have a very special part in the Pythagorean cult.
Another ideology coming from the Pythagorean school was that of possessions, that nobody owned anything, but everybody owned everything. As very much you can tell this was a pseudo-Marxist school, because they ended up sharing everything they had with each other, but never actually owning anything. This very much influenced Marx, and in fact it influenced Plato, because Like I said, nothing of Pythagoras' works survived him. But he did have some writings that he wrote, or perhaps one of his students wrote, about the Pythagorean way. This was such a sought-after knowledge piece of literature that Plato himself went to great trouble to try and find this Pythagorean book. And once he found it, this became the big inspiration for Plato's Republic. Now, Plato's Republic was heavily influenced by it. If you've ever read Plato's Republic, you can definitely tell the pseudo-Marxist ideology that was locked within the Republic. And if you ever read the Republic, you can definitely tell also that you can pretty much use it not as a one-for-one, but as a close approximation for what Pythagoras had taught in his school and what his school actually was all about.
Pythagoras and fava beans. Yes, Pythagoras not only held that you shouldn't eat animals, but you shouldn't eat fava beans as well. Now, he believed that fava beans also held the soul of humans within them. So much like with animals, you shouldn't eat them, and you shouldn't be allowed to eat them. There was even a story that Pythagoras buried some fava beans in the ground, and eventually he dug them up, and when he dug them up and held them out, he looked, and he saw the fava beans look like a human fetus. Now, that's his words, not mine, and therefore he believed that in the transmission of souls, that you shouldn't eat fava beans because it would be compared to that of cannibalism. Another Cult of Pythagoras teaching.
Now, there's two major stories on the death of Pythagoras, both probably with nuggets of truth in them, but both very similar as well, having to deal with fire, but possibly both being not exactly 100% correct or that of myths, just a little of a bump of truth. The first being that the school of Pythagoras was set ablaze. A great fire had destroyed it and killed many of its students. Pythagoras himself had escaped, but seeing the carnage and the devastation brought to his students, decided to unalive himself. Now the second is pretty much the exact same thing, but when the fire spread from Pythagoras' school and was going to engulf and kill him, he ran to a field of fava beans. Now, at the time, fava beans were thought to be a mystical and very important thing to Pythagoras. Pythagoras stopped in front of the fava beans field, and instead of running through it and trampling the fava beans, he decided to stop and to die. Now, obviously, the second is probably that much more of a slander towards Pythagoras and his ideology. The first probably being similar to that of what actually happened with his death. But nonetheless, we can never know truly for right now what happened with Pythagoras. But more than likely, the first story was that of what actually happened to him and his death.
Hey, if you're listening to this, you've watched the whole video, and I just want to thank you so much for taking the time and hopefully learned something about Pythagoras, more so that he was not just this mathematician genius that many people thought of him as, but that he was an ancient cult leader. And I hope you had a great time watching the video, and I just want to say thank you again. See you next time.